Hi, friends. Welcome back to the YouTube channel for the Renaissance English History Podcast. I am your host, Heather, and I've been podcasting on Tudor England since 2009 with my show, making it the original Tudor History Podcast. This channel is where I put all of my episodes from all of my shows, as well as lots of extra content like this video right here. Today, we are talking about a very intelligent astronomer who just happened to be the sister of another more famous astronomer. So we are going to talk about Sophia Brahe, Tycho Brahe's sister. Before we get started, though, if you would like to see more Tudor history in your YouTube feed, why not go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss a video I put out? That's a good idea. Okay, let's get into it. Picture this. A dazzling new star appears in the night sky. It is so bright that even with the naked eye, it's impossible to miss. A young girl squints upward, eyes wide in wonder, as her older brother points excitedly toward the constellation Cassiopeia. This is Heravad Abbey in Denmark, the year's 1572, and what they are witnessing will go down in astronomical history. Her brother, of course, is Tycho Brahe, the brilliant, eccentric astronomer you might have heard of. But standing there right beside him is someone who history has largely overlooked, Sophie Brahe, Tycho's younger sister and often uncredited assistant. Today, we're not talking about Tycho, we're talking about Sophie, a woman who quietly defied the odds to pursue her intellectual passions in the shadow of her famous sibling. And let me tell you, Sophie's story is anything but dim. Sophie and Tycho Brahe shared an extraordinary bond, though it didn't start out that way. Born into an influential Dutch family, the Brahes were about as high-ranking as you could get without being royalty. But Tycho, the first son, was whisked away as a toddler to live with a childless uncle who raised him as his heir. Sophie was born much later, and she grew up in the family's sprawling Knutstorp castle with the rest of the Brahe children. By the time Sophie was born, Tycho was well into his studies and his career, making him at least a decade, maybe even 13 years her senior. Their paths didn't cross often at first. You might say that Tycho had strong opinions about who could learn what. He was an eccentric genius, after all. When Sophie first showed interest in astrology and in science, Tycho tried to stop her. He dismissed her as a young girl who couldn't possibly grasp such complex ideas. But here's where things get interesting. Sophie didn't listen. Oh no. She refused to let Tycho's doubts or the restrictions placed on women of her time hold her back. She taught herself everything she could. When she couldn't read Latin, the language of most scientific works, she paid out of her own pocket to have the texts translated. She read in German, studied chemistry and horticulture, and slowly built up her knowledge. It's fun to think of this as one of those kind of sibling rivalry moments where Tycho finally had to admit, fine, she's brilliant. Because he did. Sophie's determination won him over, and by 1572, when Tycho made his famous discovery of the new star, what is now known as SN 1572, a supernova that was 7,500 light years away, Sophie was right there helping him observe and measure it. So let's set the scene. It's a crisp, dark night at Heravad Abbey, a remote old monastery where Tycho had been living and building his instruments. Tycho, staring up at the constellation Cassiopeia, notices something strange, a new star, brilliantly bright and unmoving. Unlike planets, it doesn't shift positions. Unlike other stars, it's too dazzling to ignore. This was something no one had recorded before, and it absolutely thrilled him. And who does Tycho call to come see it? His sister Sophie. Sophie's only about 13 years old at the time. There she is, standing in the darkness, her brother pointing excitedly at the sky. It's brighter than Venus, he tells her. Sophie squints, tilts her head, and marvels at it. This star, or nova as Tycho called it, was more than just a pretty sight. It challenged centuries of thinking. According to Aristotle's teachings, the heavens were unchanging, constant, perfect. A new star appearing out of nowhere completely upended that idea. It was, in a word, revolutionary. For Tycho, it was the discovery of a lifetime. For Sophie, it was one of her first recorded moments standing at her brother's side, participating in the very work that made him famous. And let's just remember, this was all done without telescopes, relying on sharp eyes and handmade instruments. Sophie didn't just look at the stars, she actually helped to measure their positions and their distances, painstakingly noting observations that would form the foundation of Tycho's astronomical theories. It should be noted that in England, Queen Elizabeth was also seeing the star. Astronomers in England were also looking at it. John Dee was working on it. Like everybody in Europe saw this new star, but Tycho was the one who measured it, and Tycho and his sister were the ones who measured it and actually came up with what it actually was. So Sophie was not satisfied to just be a passive observer. Her role grew quickly from sisterly support to something far more substantial. Tycho, realizing her talent, began to rely on her. By the time of a lunar eclipse in 1573, Sophie was fully involved in recording the observations and calculations. It's a fascinating image, this teenage girl in the 16th century, surrounded by instruments that Tycho had made himself, contributing to work that would reshape astronomy. Sophie's interests extended beyond stars. She immersed herself in fields like alchemy and horticulture, areas that, while dismissed today as pseudoscience, were highly regarded back then. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty either. She read constantly, tested her theories, and pursued her education wherever she could. People began to take notice. By the late 1570s, she was a known figure among astrologers and scholars, producing charts for wealthy patrons who needed guidance. Because, of course, in those days, wealthy patrons would ask astrologers to make their charts to help them figure out things. Like John Dee made a chart for Elizabeth to figure out her coronation day. So it was actually something that wealthy people would do to consult an astrologer. Now, while Sophie was making her mark in astrology and the sciences, she was also navigating life as a woman of her time. In 1579, she married a nobleman called Otto Thott. He was a wealthy landowner from Eriksholm, and they had one son together, Tage. For about a decade, Sophie did what was expected of her. She ran the estate, she managed the household, she took care of their son. But Sophie's life wasn't destined to be that straightforward. In 1588, Otto died, leaving her a young widow with a child to raise. And here's where Sophie's strength really shines through. Instead of retreating to the role of a grieving widow, she took control of the estate, ensuring its success until her son came of age. Then enter Erik Lange. If you're looking for a romantic subplot in this story, here it is. Erik was one of Tycho's students, brilliant, passionate, and a kind of a financial disaster. Erik spent most of his life and fortune chasing alchemy, trying to turn base metals into gold. And while the rest of Sophie's family objected to him, understandably, given his lack of prospects, Sophie didn't care. She fell for him anyway. Their love story was not easy. They were engaged for years, separated more often than not by circumstances and Erik's poor luck. Sophie poured her feelings into words, writing him long letters and even poetry, which gives us this beautifully human glimpse of her. In one poem, she compared their relationship to Urania, the muse of astronomy, and Titan, one of Saturn's moons. It's a little heartbreaking, really, this connection to the stars and skies, both so full of wonder and yet so far apart. Finally, in 1602, Sophie and Erik married, but by then, much of Erik's fortune was gone. They lived together in difficult conditions until Erik's death in 1603, after which she returned home and spent the rest of her life quietly working. She immersed herself in her studies of astrology and the natural world, and she died in 1643 at the ripe old age of 87. For context, Tycho had died all the way back in 1601. So while her brother's life burned brightly but briefly, Sophie's was a slow and steady light enduring for decades. Now, here's the thing, though, about Sophie Brahe. History hasn't always given her the credit she deserved. There's a wonder. Tycho is remembered as one of the greatest astronomers of the Renaissance, and rightly so. But Sophie was right there alongside of him, helping to make it happen. She wasn't just his sister or his assistant. She was a scientist in her own right, a woman who broke through the barriers to pursue her passions in astrology, alchemy, and horticulture, all of these sciences. And it wasn't easy. Women like Sophie were not supposed to be scholars or scientists. They weren't supposed to challenge the intellectual spaces dominated by men. But Sophie carved her own path. She taught herself, funded her own education, and earned respect in fields where women's voices were rarely heard. It's easy to wonder what Sophie might have achieved if she had been born in a different era, a time when women had equal access to education and recognition. With her intelligence, curiosity, and determination, she might have become a leading figure in astronomy or natural sciences. As it stands, though, her legacy is still extraordinary. She wasn't famous, she didn't seek fame. Instead, she just quietly pursued knowledge for the love of it, driven by a passion that outshone the constraints of her world. So there we have it, a little bit about Sophie Brahe, a star in her own right. Let me know what you think about her in the comments. If you made it to the end of this video and you enjoyed it, I sure would appreciate a press of that like button. And I hope I earned your subscription to my channel where I put out content like this on the regular. If you want to keep binging Tudor content, here is a video on Tudor astronomy that you might enjoy. And here's one that YouTube thinks you'll like. Thanks so much for watching. You are deeply loved. I'm so glad I shared the planet with you. I will be back soon. Don't forget to drink your water. Okay, friend. Bye-bye.